So welcome to What About My Needs? Women Living with HIV and the Effects of Criminalization, a panel discussion including experts in the legal system. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Naima, to start our panel. Naima?
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our first set of panelists, I'd like to acknowledge my trans sisters. When we planned this webinar, it was not our intention to leave trans women out of the conversation because you are a necessary part of ending the epidemic. But because you have a unique perspective, we feel that you should have your platform by yourself first, because it's not going to be the end of the conversation, but you should be able to discuss your unique perspective without being overshadowed. In January of 2021, the Ohio Modernization Movement plans to have a webinar for trans women in the community and to make sure that we represent them on the panel. So we want you to look out for that. And if anyone knows of any trans women that would be might want to serve as panelists on that webinar in January, please let Kim know. So first of all, I have a few statistics. So in 2019, it was estimated that 19.2 million women were living with HIV, and that half of them were, that people living with, and 48% were women. So, and it was estimated that 1.2 million people, adults that were of new diagnosis in 2019 were women. In Ohio, 75% are men living with HIV, but 21% are women. So while these statistics may seem to be small, because in proportion to our male counterparts, women don't make up a great percentage, but we are by design underrepresented in the count in terms of women born women and in terms of women who are considered trans or women of trans experience. So I hope that you, while the facts and the conversation is about women, we would like for people to understand that in order to truly end the epidemic, everyone should be at the table. Everyone should have a perspective because men affect women. And so by design, we should definitely be part of the conversation, because we are, unless you're an ID user or unless you acquired the virus another way, you get it from having heterosexual sex with a man. So by design, we should be at the table. Okay, so our first group of panelists is Jan McMillan-Smith, who is a licensed social worker who has been working with people living with HIV in the Cleveland community since 1989. She created a program, Compass Services at Metro Health, and I know I'm not saying that right, a service that's designed to support and guide people living with HIV to a path of wellness. Our second speaker is Kim, who is a Central Ohio staff attorney for for Equality Ohio, and former practicing community criminal law. I'm gonna get this right eventually. So I'd like to welcome both of them, and I'd like to turn the conversation over to Jen McMillan-Smith.
Thank you so much, Nina. I'm going to share my screen with y'all so you can see my slides. Okay. Can somebody give me a thumbs up that you can see this okay? Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you briefly about what we see in Metro Health and social work that are the issues impacting women living with HIV. So no one's going to be surprised to hear that there are racial disparities in infection rates for women with HIV. There are just 13% of women in the United States who are Black, but 60% of newly diagnosed women in 2018 were Black. That means that women who are Black were diagnosed with HIV at a rate 14 times higher than white women. And for Latinas, that rate was 3 times higher. There are also gender disparities that women deal with, and this is seen in areas of research, like clinical trials where women are often underrepresented. There are standard doses of drugs that are created from those clinical trials, and they're usually geared toward men, despite difference in hormones and women tending to just be physically smaller in size. There are also women-specific research issues, such as how U equals U, or undetectable equals untransmittable. We know that that is true during sex, but women would also like to know, how does that impact breastfeeding? And that's not something that's really prioritized in the research. HIV prevention research is geared toward options toward men. I'm not saying that we don't look at options for women, but primarily things are approved faster for men because there are more men living with HIV than women. And an example is that Descovy is not approved for people with, that's supposed to say vaginas, but I have a typo there, so there's no S on vaginas. So the other thing is that HIV itself presents a little differently in women. Women tend to be a little bit older at diagnosis than men. People might often hear that newly diagnosed people are often young Black men who have sex with men, but women tend to be a little bit older. 36% were 45 years or older when they were diagnosed. And HIV is passed twice as easily from men to women than the opposite. So most women who are living with HIV were exposed via sex with men. That's 80%. Women tend to have lower viral loads at diagnosis, which is a good thing, but the flip side of that is they also tend to have lower T cells. So that is suggestive of HIV maybe progressing a little faster in women. Women are also more likely to experience thrush, which is a yeast infection in the mouth and throat, as well as bacterial pneumonia. But women are much less likely to experience opportunistic infections like Kaposi sarcoma. So there are a lot of commonalities and concerns for people living with HIV, but there's a little complications for some of these for women. So a common concern that any person living with HIV might have is, can I have children? What about my reproductive health? So for women, HIV is often identified during pregnancy. So then a woman is left with managing being pregnant and adjusting to that HIV status, and that's just not an experience that men have. Women then are told by nurses when they're in the hospital, by the WIC dietitian when they go to get some help to get formula, why aren't you breastfeeding? You should breastfeed, that's best for your baby. Well, the woman knows that that's not best for her baby, but she really might not be comfortable disclosing why. Then once a woman has children, then there's the issue of childcare and how do I get the healthcare that I need if there's not childcare available for my kids. Then those kids might need to know about HIV in the future. Maybe the child has HIV, probably not. Thankfully, these days we have very few children born with HIV. But that a lot of times moms want to talk to their kids about their own HIV status, especially when kids start to become adolescents. Also, there is some evidence that some HIV medications can impact birth control, so that definitely is a reproductive health issue, and women often have to deal with increased incidence of yeast infections and having more frequent OBGYN visits because just by virtue of being HIV positive, your pregnancy is high risk. And then there's also increased risk of HPV, cervical cancer, that type of thing. When people living with HIV are aging, there are different concerns for women. Everybody who is HIV positive, there's mounting evidence that shows that aging related concerns are accelerated for people with HIV. So you might have high blood pressure earlier, you might have high cholesterol earlier. But then for women, there's the osteoporosis concern, which we all have as we age. I'm a woman, I'm unfortunately aging, or fortunately, because it beats the alternative, right? But if I were a woman living with HIV, I would have increased osteoporosis risk because of the HIV medications, the HIV itself, and because I'm a woman aging, and also the HPV that I mentioned earlier. Also, there's some evidence now that menopause may come earlier for women living with HIV, and they might not even notice at first, attributing those night sweats to HIV infection instead of to an early experience of menopause. Now, every person living with HIV might be concerned about sex, relationships, and disclosure, but for women, women often tend to take care of others before themselves, and that shows up sometimes in how we have relationships with other people. There are safety concerns for a lot of people during disclosing HIV status, but that can be particularly true for women, since women sometimes tend to be just physically smaller or not as strong as partners if there were a physical concern, which we do see a lot of. And there is that stigma of, how do I tell someone, will they still want to be with me? That is a common concern for any person living with HIV. Sometimes women have less agency in negotiating sex and how they'll use protection with partners. And we know that it sometimes shows up with sexual violence. There's domestic violence a lot experienced by women. 55% of women living with HIV report experiences of intimate partner violence, which is twice the national rate for women in general. So that, as you can imagine, can lead to mental health concerns, particularly trauma for women. So women in the United States living with HIV report having been physically or sexually abused as children twice as often as women who don't have HIV. By the way, my source for all of this information is the Well Project. You should visit thewellproject.org. I actually forgot to put that on my slide, so please note that, thewellproject.org. Almost 1/3 of women living with HIV have PTSD, which is a 5 times higher rate than women in general. And that makes women who have PTSD, it makes them 4 times more likely to not be virally suppressed. And we know that that's so important for a woman or a person living with HIV's health and the health of any kind of partners to have that viral suppression. So I want to tell you about a person that I've worked with. I'm using a pseudonym. This is not her real name, and I'm hiding some other details to protect her confidentiality as well. And then I'll pass the mic off to my colleague to discuss the legal ramifications. But we're going to call her Allie. And when she was a young teenager, she was a runaway. And she encountered a much older man who preyed upon her in that vulnerable state of being a runaway. She endured months of sexual and emotional abuse that eventually led to her getting infected with HIV from this man. So as you might imagine, she has suffered a lot of trauma, self-esteem issues, and she has really deep internalized stigma. That's led her to have a lot of difficulty adhering to taking her medicine. She once told me, every time I try to swallow that pill, I can barely get it down because it makes me want to throw up because it makes me think of him. She has depression, and more recently, in the recent years, it's been almost 10 years since she experienced the traumatic situation for the months of abuse by this man. Even though it's 10 years away, she still really struggles with this. This is not something that improves over time if it's not addressed and people don't have access to the service that they need. And so she has a lot of addiction problems. This addiction has led her to sex work to support that addiction, and sometimes criminal justice involvement because of that. So a recent situation that she's experienced is that she sought help at a local organization. She received that help, and then once she left the organization, was discharged from that help, one of the helping professionals solicited her for sex. She, and which we all can realize that that's really unethical. There are a lot of different problems with that, right? But she And that really repeats a trauma cycle for her, that someone that was in a position where she should have been able to trust them instead just looked at her as someone that he could solicit sex from. And she was reluctant to report this, even though this was a helping professional, due to the law that because she was engaging in sex work, that increases her misdemeanor solicitation, what it should be, to felony solicitation simply because she's a woman who's living with HIV. So as you can see, there's a lot of complex issues here, and I think I've said enough, and I will pass this along. I'll stop sharing my screen for the next speaker, Kim.
Hi, thanks so much, Jen. So again, can everyone hear me? Can I get a thumbs up as well? I am Kim Burrows. I am a staff attorney for the Equality Ohio Legal Clinic. We offer pro bono legal services to folks under a certain income threshold who identify as LGBTQ+. Just a quick plug for our clinic, but just to pick up right where Jen left off. So when you add incarceration to all of the reasons that make it difficult for Allie to take her medication, to develop any ability to protect herself from the service provider that Jen mentioned, things get even worse. In prisons and carceral systems throughout the country, healthcare is limited to inmates. Many prisons have limited reproductive care, pregnancy care, especially mental health care, which sounds like Allie would benefit from addressing that deep-seated trauma that's contributing to a cycle of violence. Once women are incarcerated, we'll get to the statutes in Ohio that target sex workers and people living with HIV in a moment. But once those statutes ensnare individuals living with, and they end up in the prison system, our prison systems are generally not designed to treat the underlying mental and physical healthcare needs that people living with HIV, specifically women living with HIV, need to have met. So there's a national survey of prison health care that was conducted by the CDC. I've got the link in the slides here if anybody needs the slides after our presentation. It surveyed 45 participating states and found that while 29 states have prison systems where women who are pregnant or individuals who are pregnant are sent to off-site locations to local hospitals that are well equipped for pregnancy, for delivery. 29 states send women outside of the prison. 16 states, or 35% of the surveyed states, have women deliver babies inside of the prison system, which prison systems are generally lacking in specialized equipment and personnel should situations arise. And as Jen just reviewed, pregnant people living with HIV have a whole host of specific needs related to that HIV positive status. Pregnant people who are living with HIV must receive specialized medical care. There are viral suppression medications that are important both for the well-being of the mother and to prevent transmission of HIV to the unborn child. This medication needs to be delivered throughout the course of the pregnancy. While medication is generally available inside of prisons, in my experience, I used to be a prosecutor and I used to work with the Federal Public Defender's Office. In my experience, those medications tend to not be the most current medications. They're generics, they're things that have been available for a long time. So the availability of, for example, antiviral medication that people are not resistant to might be limited. Medication also needs to be administered to the newborn for 4 to 6 weeks after birth. Cesarean delivery, C-sections, can sometimes limit the transmission to newborns if viral load is not adequately controlled, and the availability of a C-section in a prison context is certainly not guaranteed. And again, as Jen mentioned, mothers living with HIV should follow certain protocols to ensure that transmission doesn't occur, like not breastfeeding, and the availability of postnatal education for mothers in those circumstances, again, may be limited by the fact that they are incarcerated. And if they are unable to find knowledgeable healthcare workers in local hospitals, that problem is compounded by the fact that they find themselves in a carceral setting. Another issue related to healthcare and HIV in the prison system is the availability of healthcare to people who are incarcerated, who are released from incarceration. So when you are incarcerated, if you are on Medicare, your Medicare is either suspended or terminated throughout the duration of your term of incarceration. 34 states cancel Medicaid, not Medicare. I do that all the time. 34 states cancel Medicaid coverage of a person who's incarcerated, which means when that person is released, they need to initiate the process of obtaining Medicaid again, and their eligibility is in some ways affected by their status as an incarcerated person. So federally, Medicaid does not pay for medical services to people who are in prison. A study, and I got my sites down here on this slide, in a 2009 study, the effect of this can be pretty significant. As you can see, in a study of 1,094 people who are leaving prison, 1 year after they leave prison, only 67.2% are still receiving medical care for their HIV positive status. A year after that, only 51.3% are receiving medical care for their HIV, and the year after that, only 42.5%. So this is true of both men and women, all people who are released, who are HIV positive from prison, but certainly given the special needs of women who are HIV positive, it's something to keep in mind. Bridge services for reentry certainly could need to focus on the availability of healthcare for people who are living with HIV. Jen also mentioned the overlap of healthcare, special considerations for transgender women. Jen mentioned birth control. So there are some guidelines for transgender women who are receiving HRT therapy and who need HIV antiretroviral medication. There are some studies that suggest that the antiretroviral medication interacts with birth control, and from those studies, medical providers are inferring how antiretroviral medication interacts with HRT. What's the problem there? Nobody's actually studying how these medications interact in a way that might be detrimental to transgender women. When I was preparing for this presentation, I was just shocked over and over again by how few statistics are available for the folks that we're here to help. Okay, let's fast forward to Ohio law on criminalizing HIV. So I have a lot of text in these slides. I've given you the statutory language. I am not going to read all of it, and I don't expect you to read all of it, but I did want to make the legalese available. So there are a number of crimes in Ohio that criminalize conduct more severely if the person engaging in the conduct is HIV positive. And of the 5 or so crimes that I've listed here, 3 of them specifically target sex workers. Keep in mind that women make up in Ohio about 25% of new cases, new HIV cases each year. But from what I could tell, about 80% of sex workers are women. So there's a little bit of a disproportionate impact there. with regard to who represents new HIV cases. So one of the most serious crimes in Ohio related to that criminalizes HIV status is called felonious assault. It is basically engaging in sexual conduct with another person when the person knows that they are HIV positive and fails to disclose their HIV positive status. I've got the sentences down here. It's a second-degree felony. That's the most severe level of felony in Ohio is a first-degree felony. So this is on par with robbery and burglary and some other very serious violent crimes. It's important to know that this word knowingly that I have bolded and underlined here in Ohio law means the person subjectively believes that there is a high probability that a fact is true. So it doesn't mean that knowingly the way that we all use it in our common day-to-day language, our day-to-day speech. Typically, when I think of whether I know something or I don't know something, it's either 100% or 0%. In Ohio law, if there's a pretty big risk that you have contracted HIV, that you are HIV positive, and you do not take any measures to find out whether you are or you aren't, and then you engage in this conduct, that is still grounds for prosecution for felonious assault. So these are very, very harsh laws. Okay. So here in felonious assault, in this crime, if you engage in sexual conduct with another without disclosing, without disclosing your HIV positive status. Notice that it doesn't require an actual showing that you harmed someone. It doesn't require a showing that you transmitted the virus to another person. Just if you engage in sexual conduct and you know you're HIV positive, regardless of whether you're on PrEP, regardless of whether you've used a condom, regardless of all of the preventative measures you may have taken to make sure that your partner does not contract the virus, still a second-degree felony here in Ohio. Sexual conduct is kind of what you would think of: vaginal intercourse, anal intercourse, fellatio, even fellatio and cunnilingus, which, as most of us know, as Jen mentioned, are generally preferable to reduce the transmission of HIV. The only way to protect yourself from felonious assault prosecution is to disclose your status prior to engaging in sexual conduct. This is called an affirmative defense. What that means, the phrase affirmative defense, means that it is the burden of proving whether or not you disclosed in the court of law is not on the prosecutor, it's on the person being prosecuted. So that means you would no longer have your right to remain silent, possibly. You would, generally a criminal defendant does not have to do anything. It's the prosecutor's burden to prove the case. With an affirmative defense, the defendant actually does need to present a case. Otherwise, they cannot assert this defense. So there are a lot of implications for your criminal rights because this is an affirmative defense. What's an adequate disclosure? That's kind of a case-by-case thing. It's up to the jury. We would recommend something like a text message, something that you have evidence of to show that you did disclose your HIV status to your partner. Here are some ideas. Ohio is a one-party consent recording state. That means that you can secretly record a conversation that you're having with another person so long as you consent to the recording. So you can record a verbal conversation. You can have a written statement signed. I'll leave it up to you guys to figure out how realistic that is. And text messages seem to be the most realistic as far as I can tell. So aside from felonious assault, what are the other crimes in Ohio that address HIV positive status? Like I said, a number of them are sex worker specific. So here you see this with knowledge once again. Knowledge does not mean what we think it means. It means, you know, a reasonable likelihood that something is true. So with knowledge that a person has tested positive for HIV, shall engage in sexual activity for hire. Now, this is important. Sexual activity is broader than sexual conduct. What does that mean? Sexual conduct we already talked about. That is your typical penetrative sexual acts. Sexual contact includes the touching of an erogenous zone. So this would be, you know, using your hand to you know, massage or masturbate another person. The touching of buttocks, of a pubic region, of breasts. None of these things transmit HIV to the other person, but they are still criminalized as if they are HIV, you know, under this specific HIV provision of the crime of prostitution after a positive HIV test. Prostitution generally is a third-degree misdemeanor. When you add these, the penalty enhancement for an HIV positive person prosecuted under this crime raises it from a third-degree misdemeanor to a second-degree felony. That is the largest jump in criminal law that I have yet encountered. Again, it's on par with burglary and robbery. And again, a second-degree felony conviction carries a mandatory prison sentence. So the court is required to impose anywhere from a 2-year sentence to an 8-year sentence. And you know, we've already discussed the implications of incarceration and healthcare issues related to incarceration. Okay, another offense, soliciting after positive HIV test. Similar to the previous statute, although it does involve soliciting, again, the language here is sexual activity. So if an individual who is HIV positive solicits another person for, you know, conduct that does not transmit the virus, it nevertheless can result in this elevated crime. This also goes from, I believe, a third or fourth degree misdemeanor to a third degree felony. So again, very serious enhancement for conduct that does not seem to fit the public policy here. And again, here is another sex work related crime, loitering to engage in solicitation. Here again, we see an elevation from a low level misdemeanor to a 5th degree felony. The last crime that I have to discuss today is harassment by an inmate. So for some reason, this crime is titled harassment by an inmate, but it actually does not involve people who are incarcerated all of the time. So if a person with knowledge that they are HIV positive and with intent, so that means in your mind you have to be intending to harass, annoy, threaten, or alarm another person, shall cause that person to come into contact with blood, semen, urine, feces, or another bodily substance. And then again, selling or donating contaminated blood. Both of these are also felonies and significant enhancements based on HIV positive status. Like I mentioned earlier today, there are not good statistics on sex workers. There are not many folks that I'm aware of. If anybody else is aware of resources on this and is willing to share it in the chat, I'd be grateful, but I could not find many statistical studies on sex work within the United States. From what I could find, the estimate is that 80% of sex workers are assigned female sex at birth. Like we heard earlier today, only about 25% of new cases in Ohio are new cases for women. So I think that tells us that HIV criminalization measures don't actually promote the public health policies or justice that the state of Ohio seems to be attempting to enact in its criminal laws. So things that you should do anytime that you are required to interact with law enforcement, but especially in these HIV positive criminal cases, ask for an attorney immediately, and you need to be very explicit. And like Jen said, this can be a problem for women because we tend not to be direct. We don't want to hurt people's feelings or be rude. I tell people, when you are dealing with a police officer and you want an attorney, be rude. Say, I will not talk to you until I have an attorney. I am exercising my constitutional rights to an attorney. That's how direct you need to be. If you are not that direct, then the police officers will continue to question you and they will not be violating your rights. You need to be very direct. Aside from, always comply physically. So if police officers are giving you commands, telling you to stand in a certain place, put your hands behind your back, put you in a police car, do not resist any of those things. Just don't talk, don't use your words. Same thing here. One thing that's pretty common with folks who are incarcerated in prisons, I'm not sure about how common this is in jails, which is a temporary, like, pre-conviction form of incarceration. Some people are prophylactically tested for HIV when they are incarcerated. It is important, this may not work, but it is important to not consent to medical tests so that later on your lawyers can use your lack of consent to prevent that from being used against you. Odds are the test will happen anyway, but it is important to say, I do not consent. Again, because evidence of your HIV positive status is part of the crime that they are charging. So if we could keep that from being admissible in court, that's an important thing to accomplish. And none of the, let's see, felonious assault, prostitution, solicitation, and loitering related to HIV positive status, none of those crimes can be sealed or expunged. So even folks who, get involved in catch court or otherwise find ways if they so choose, end their participation in sex work or avoid further criminal offenses, still these convictions will follow them for years and years to come. And harassment with bodily substance and selling or donating contaminated blood, those are case-by-case questions. So I think, Kim, should I keep going here? I'm a little bit over time.
Why don't you take the one question we have?
Okay.
Do you want me to read it, or do you want to just take it?
Sure, why don't you go ahead and read that?
Okay, so the question that came in was, given the climate in which we are living in, do you feel the Me Too Time's Up movement will be a plus for women being targeted by HIV criminalization, or a hindrance, since the laws are based solely on non-disclosure?
I think that's
simplify it in your answer.
Yeah, that's a really smart question. So let me take us back to felonious assault so we can all see the language. So this crime says, no person with knowledge that the person is HIV positive shall knowingly engage in sexual conduct with another person without disclosing that knowledge. So that would seem to fit a victim of rape, or even a victim of gross sexual imposition. Actually, no, just rape. So the question, as I understand it, is getting at the question of, if you are not consenting to this sexual activity, can you still be prosecuted for felonious assault? So the answer to that as a legal issue is no, because every crime has what's called an implied element of the person engaging in the conduct that's criminalized must be engaging in that conduct voluntarily. So the classic law school example is, let's say you're in a car and you are just riding around with your friend and you think you're going to Steak and Shake, and then your friend, without telling you, drives you onto somebody's private property, tells you to wait in the car, goes in, commits a burglary, comes out, and then you drive off. If you as the passenger appear to be committing a trespass, but you're not, because you had no say in that. You were trapped in that car. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't get out. You can't be prosecuted for trespass there. Same thing applies here. If you are not voluntarily engaging in this conduct, if you can't get out of it no matter what you do, and not that you need to resist. I mean, voluntariness is a broad thing. So it takes into account some of the ideas of fight, flight, or freeze. But basically, if you are the victim of a rape, you are not engaging in this conduct voluntarily, so you can't be prosecuted.
I think Julie put in a question about if a person can sign up for Ryan White Part A, would that give them their emergency meds when they are out of incarceration? So Jen, you want to tackle that question?
Sure. I think I put the answer in the chat too, that basically the answer is yes. If somebody shows up to any Ryan White funded clinic or case management agency, or basically anyone that knows about Ryan White would be able to get the medication for that person.
So I guess my question for you, and then we'll move on, would be, what if that person doesn't know anything about Ryan White? What if the jail that they're in or prison that they're in doesn't give them that opportunity? They just send them out the door with 2 weeks worth of meds, but no resources. How would they then find out about Ryan White?
Sure. So that does happen on occasion, I think, but usually the Ohio Department of Health has a person who is connected to the prison system. So when somebody is released, they do try to do a warm handoff and at least let a clinic know, like, hey, this person is coming out of prison. Can we schedule them an appointment with you at Metro? I work at Metro. So if they live on the west side of Cleveland and they said they wanted to come to Metro, then we would know that that person was supposed to be showing up. And if they didn't, then we would be able to reach out to them. If they don't know about it, that's a good question. Hopefully they'll Google something. If they have internet access, that might get them to the right place. Other than that, I'm not sure how they would find out about it. Do you have any ideas about that, Naima? I know you do the same kind of work as I do.
Well, I mean, I think that part of the problem I see is that there's no follow through. So we have people who come here to Circle Health, but they may not stay in care. And so I don't think we do a very good job of keeping people in care, or we don't get them on insurances fast enough because of the system, not because of us applying for it, but necessarily because the way the system works. And if you're a woman and you don't want anyone to know that you're HIV positive, you may not give that information to someone to help you. So part of it is the patient themselves not wanting to disclose their status when they get out of prison, or just not wanting to share their status, period, because of the self-stigma that they have.
For sure. I think you just made a great argument for universal health care as well.
I know, right? Okay, so we're going to move on. So we got the perspective from social work, we got perspective from law, and so now we're going to move into the foot soldiers, the people who are on the ground, so to speak, in the community. And our first speaker, her name is Michelle Jackson Rawlins. She is an MSW, a founder of and CEO of We Think for a Change. Michelle specializes in leading organizations through her expertise in outreach, educating facilities, and working to increase in awareness, I cannot say that word, reduce stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS. The second speaker is myself. I'm stepping in the gap for someone who was unable to present. So my name is Naima O'Neill. I am by trade a social worker. That is my profession, but I also am a woman living with HIV, and I have been for almost 30 years, since 1992. I was pregnant, so I can speak to what happens when a woman finds out, because I found out that I was HIV positive while being pregnant. And so that's a unique situation. I will answer any question that people want, and I will I'm going to let Michelle speak first from the community perspective, and then I'll speak from a woman living with perspective. So, Michelle, you're up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jen and Kim, for that wealth of information. Well, the hope to involve women until women have a voice and real control over their bodies. We can't make no assumption about which one of our women friends most needs help and support. And the vision of empowering women, Black women are especially placed with the burden of being too strong to experience pain, Black power, despite being more at risk of mental illness like depression, anxiety, and oppressive compulsive disorder. Nowadays, women are showing up and supporting other women. And first, I'd like to talk about the women at risk, women in the community at risk. When we talk about women at risk in the community, there's no reason to have a positive diagnosis today. There are preventive steps, and we can practice safe sex behavior using condoms, get tested and treated for sexual transmitted infections, avoid injecting drugs, or if you do, use sterile needles and syringes. Ensure that any blood or blood products that you might need are tested for HIV, and use condom prior to engaging in high-risk behavior. We also have PrEP and PEP. And to have real power over our bodies, women must build a toolbox. Women have come a long way, and yet sometimes it can feel like the process has been completely halted. Clearly, we still have a way to go. As a community, let's check in to see how women are caring for themselves holistically, mentally, emotionally, or physical health. Since COVID-19, the conversation about HIV seems to have stopped. And we have concerns about the care providers outside of the HIV arena. Just to give you an example, I was at the airport having a conversation with a lady, and we were discussing what she do and what I do. Come to find out, she was the nurse over all the nurses of the state of Ohio. And I said, oh, wow. Then I started talking about HIV and prevention and PrEP, and she knew nothing about PrEP. She was just so outdone. She went and Googled it and she couldn't believe it. So, we still have concerns about having conversation with medical providers outside of the HIV care providers. Women living with HIV in the community, well, you equals you. They are doing their part, advocating. Once diagnosed, it means the person is past the diagnosis and it's time to live and think about what's next. Being those next steps by discovering a purpose, women supporting each other, continue to be in around uplifting positive women and staying connected. Role models to help focus on what's next, and taking on themselves and to determine what's next. And some of the examples is Women We Think for a Change Women's Retreat that's coming up, group support, safe place to share from the hard things that they have in common. They need the space to be able to share. And some may require funding, and we're working on that. And this is just a list of some of the things that women in the community can have. Women can have voices and real power over their bodies. What do you think, Naima?
I tend to agree with you. I know that for a lot of women, we do get over the self-stigma. For the most part, we do get over being HIV positive, but what we don't is we don't get necessarily nurtured to go in these spaces where conversations are being had, conversations about where money is being spent or the importance of where money is supposed to go. We're not necessarily taught or even nurtured to go into these spaces. I know that there's a national organization called Positive Women's Network who does a very good job all over the country of trying to train women, to teach women about their rights, their reproductive rights, and that they have somewhat of a responsibility to teach others, but they have a right to take care of their bodies, and they have a right to do that. I think that funding, to me, we operate in silos, so whatever is best practice for them, that's what they do. But in order to end the AIDS epidemic, to me, and the reason for this whole webinar is that women are an important part of that. We're a vital part of that. There should be discussions about everyone, not just men, same gender loving men, not just trans men and women. It should be, if you're having sex and you're HIV positive, then we should be having a discussion about you taking care of yourself so that you can not spread the virus to other people, and then to encourage people, women, to take PrEP, to be able to understand that that's there in their toolbox in order to prevent them from becoming positive. I just think that we don't do enough to be inclusive of everyone, that we want to talk about certain individuals, but women are acquiring the virus from men. So how are the men acquiring? And we don't talk about that. We don't really talk about heterosexual men. They're not standing next to their female counterparts. So there's a lot of people who need to be at the table that are not at the table. And I think it's unfortunate, because if we really, really want to get rid of the virus, and I wonder about that sometimes, do we really want it to end? Because I think that we know what's necessary, but are we willing to maybe give up our platforms? And I'm talking about our men counterparts, and privilege in order to do that.
Well, Naomi, you do have the one question here that is about, we were talking about women supporting women. The question is since this webinar is about, women's needs, what is the response to those women who shun or have ill feelings against women who do sex work and feel they cast a negative light on women's empowerment movement? Okay,
so I feel that question really has to do with inequality with work. Because I really do believe that since we don't live, and I'm gonna use Brian Jones's session, since we don't live single issue lives, I think that people not being able to support themselves financially, and if they know, because sex work is work, we don't want to call it work, but it is work, and it's how it's how women or men can obtain income in order to support themselves. So if we give them childcare, we give them reasonable employment, not just $9 an hour, so that they can really maintain taking care of themselves. I often wonder, would women still want to do sex work? And some will, but I want to say that maybe the vast majority would not. And I think that until we deal with other issues related to employment, to the rated to fair employment, rated to once I get out of prison, can I get a real meaningful job, not just working at McDonald's, nothing shady on McDonald's, but we need to be able to give people real opportunities to take care of themselves. And I think until we do that, are we punishing people for trying to do the best that they feel that they can, dealing with the system and dealing with maybe being a a person that was once incarcerated and can't obtain a good job. I mean, there's a whole lot of variables to that question. But to answer it, I don't think that we should penalize them because sex workers work. It may not be work that's society driven, but it is work.
Thanks, Naima. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to move to some final instructions. I'm going to put the link for the evaluation and quiz for the CEUs. I invite anybody to fill it out and do at least the evaluation part. But when you enter for your CEUs, you will need to put your license number. I also am going to put the link to our website, to the page where we keep our webinars, so that you could go back to former webinars, and a place where you can go to see what's coming up next. And speaking of coming up next, on November 30th, OHMM will be hosting the Virtual World AIDS Day happy hour and hashtag launch. So I'm teasing it, and I'm going to put a little early registration link here as well. So thanks again, everybody, and we will see you in January for our monthly webinars. We do have one message. Great job. Okay, bye, everyone.